Okay, hi everybody, and welcome to this week's event. So what I'm doing this week is I'm going through the VBA Handbook and I'm going through the very first application. And just going through it, I'm going to give you like tips, tricks, and just some explanations on different things you can use and different techniques. Because when you put a manual together like this, you kind of want to streamline it between having having enough information but not having too much information, because then the whole kind of how you build the application gets lost. But on a video you get to kind of show tips and tricks very quickly, so the video format is quite good to complement this. And also you can ask questions live, and so I can give you feedback as we go through it, so it's quite good. Hey Machi, how are you doing? Good to hear from you. Can you guys just let me know? I'll just put the message in. Just, is my sound okay? Because it's always good to check sound. Once I did a half an hour on a webinar where the sound wasn't working. So we'll just get started in under 2 minutes. Just wait for everybody just to get up and running here, and then we'll kick it off. So the first project is quite nice. It's got a lot of good information in it, but it's quite small, but it has a lot of kind of vital stuff that you do when you're building an application. Hi Sean, how are you doing? Sound is a bit low. I must test out this microphone. I don't know, I think it's probably just because I'm using an encoder, and it just seems to be a bit lower than when I just used the kind of standard screen. So I'll just have to test it during the week and just see. But as long as you can hear me and everything, that's pretty good. Maybe I just might move it a bit nearer to me if I can. I'm actually probably get a better stand for it, because it's, yeah, I won't attempt to move it now because I'll just knock over everything. I probably should put it on this side. But anyway. Okay, sound is good, Jay. Okay, cool enough. Cool, pretty cool. So just waiting for the last few seconds, and then we'll just get into the first VBA handbook. So reading match results from the user. And the session today probably take about an hour, and shouldn't be too much longer than that really. And then questions and answers probably. Normally it takes about 45 minutes, but it depends on the questions, etc. Hi Kevin, yeah, great to hear that the sound is working as well. Okay, pretty cool. So we're just about at 8 o'clock, I think. And there we are, 8 o'clock. Okay, so I'll just kick it off then. So again, everybody, welcome to today's webinar. And here I'm going to go through the very first application in the VBA handbook, which is reading match results. So I can close this down now, and we can just get on with looking at the application itself. So the reason I chose this application is because it has quite a lot of kind of useful items that we use in VBA. So in VBA, what we're always doing is we're always reading data from a worksheet and writing it to another worksheet. Now, sometimes you can be writing from a database, or you can end up like sending by email. But most of the time, you're reading from a worksheet and writing to another one. And also what we have here is that we're opening a worksheet to write to it. So there's a lot of useful kind of basic techniques in this one that you'll kind of take away and you can use in other applications. So the data here that we have is World Cup matches. And I thought it gave a very nice kind of application to use, because, for example, there can be two teams, and based on what the user selects, we want to pick teams from both columns. So it's a nice kind of application. Again, the data doesn't matter. Like, as far as VBA is concerned, the data could be on cars, or it could be on fruit, or it could be on anything. But so from our perspective, it's quite a nice bit of data to use. So what we have data from two World Cups, and the 2014 Football World Cup and the 2010 Football World Cup. So what we want to do is we want to allow the user to make selections, and we'll bring back results based on their selections. So let's just open this guy here. So the way it's going to work is that when the user makes a selection, so they select the year, they select the file name which we have configurable, and I'll just talk more about that later. And then they have the theme which they can type in. Now normally we'd use a drop down for the theme, but I just want to show you later what would happen if someone put in the wrong, just spelled it wrong or something like that. So we click on view matches based on our selections, and this will bring back the actual results. Now my computer's slow, but that's because I'm running encoder software, so normally it would happen almost instantly. So what we have, you can see, is a list of all the matches that Spain played through the World Cup. So if we were to change this team to say something like Brazil, for example, and we click on view matches, it'll bring us back all the matches from Brazil. And again, if we change the year to 2014, click on view matches, it brings us all Brazil's matches back from 2014. Okay, Promi, your screen still says please stand by. Yeah, it might sometimes the stream is just maybe the stream just takes a bit longer to start, but yeah, I'm looking at it myself here now, and it seems to be okay. Let me just turn down this, and this should make my computer slightly faster. And just turn down the sound so that I don't have an echo in the background. Okay, so we've one other button here, and the button we have is clear matches. Now, anytime that you're writing software, particularly if you have output like this, what tends to happen is you're going to run through the code a lot of times writing out the report, and you're going to be making changes. So you'll have to clear the data a lot, and the reason you clear it is, first of all, you don't want to taint it with your current data, so you don't want data that's left over there. And the second thing is you're going to have to just keep clearing it each time. So it's just as easy to have a clear matches button, and this clears our data. And then we can also use the same clear matches function to clear the data before we write, so that we know that the output we're writing is clean. So this is the full one working. So let's get down to building it from scratch. So let me just, won't save this one, and we'll just exit. So Peter, you're saying the screen is blurry. If the quality isn't that good, just go to the settings on YouTube and just set up the settings. Yeah, if you select 1080, just select the highest settings, because the screen quality is set to the highest on this. So that's why I use the encoder. So if you set it to 180 in YouTube, just in the bottom settings, you should see it crystal clear. So now what we're going to do is we're going to start with a template sheet. So this is basically just a copy. We've copied template, we have a World Cup report, and this is the one we're going to use. So this has the basics on the worksheet, but it doesn't have any of the code. So we can just get up and running from scratch. So here we are. Again, the buttons aren't connected. So even if we put our cursor over it, they won't click, because there isn't anything that's connected. So the first thing that we want to do is we want to add our click events. So the way we do this, now if you were on the 7 steps webinar that I do, so I go through adding click events and so on. So as we go through the applications here, we're going to actually see them kind of in real time actually working. Okay, screen is perfect now, Blender. Okay, that's pretty cool. So if we right click and we insert a module, so what we want to do is we want to call this click events. So again, it's a good idea to have our modules with kind of names that we recognize. And click events is where we put the subs that are fired when we click a button. So when we click a button, it fires a sub, so that it runs the code in the sub. And we want to put these in our click events module. So they're very easy to find if we want to check them or delete them or add them or update them and so on. So we're going to just call 2 of these here. We're going to have one for each of the buttons. And what we're going to call them is, we'll make it a public sub and generate reports. And what we say is we say underscore click. And the reason we say underscore click is because it means at a glance then that we can see that these are click events. So it's very, very apparent straight away. Now, these things that I'm saying here, they may seem very like, you know, they may seem a bit like overkill or a bit like too much. But when you actually have a big project with lots of code, if you start to have just your click events in different places and you don't have them called underscore click, it starts to grow really, really messy. So the idea is here that from the very start that we have a nice, neat structure. So let's do a clear report as well. So now we've got our two actual subs that we're going to use. So we're going to connect these to the buttons. So we go to our worksheet and we right click on the button and then we select assign macro. And I'll just pull that into the middle of the screen. So we just click on the one we want and we click OK. Now again, we do the very same with clear matches. We right click, select assign macro, and then we clear the report. So now we have our two buttons and we have them connected to our empty subs. So far so good. So now what we want to do next is we want to have the create report sub. So we're going to insert a module here and I'm going to call it team results. So again, we can call the module anything we want, but the purpose here is that we have modules and they group together similar subs. So click events has all the events. Team results here has everything to do with this current report that we're creating. And we're just going to call a sub and we're going to call it create report. And so there's our create report. So this is where we're going to do all the kind of hard work. Now what we want to do is we want to just check that our structure is working. So in here we're going to call create report. Now here's just a tip. When we start to write something like this, if we press control space, so control space like this, VBA brings up IntelliSense and this helps us kind of finish what we're doing. So we can see a list of possible ways we can finish this. Now if we keep typing, if we type E and we type R, it brings us up to the one we want. Now we can finish this by just pressing tab or space. So tab just ends it and space just ends it with a space. And so this is very, very, very useful. Now if we want to go to create report from here, we can just right click and select definition from the menu. And this will bring us to our create report. So now what we're going to do here is we're going to use debug print. So debug print, again, very, very useful tool. And what this does is it prints to our immediate window. So I'm just going to print the name of this to our immediate window. So the immediate window is just a small window that appears in this screen. So in our Visual Basic editor. So we select view immediate window like this, or Control G if you prefer, and I'll just hide the watch window. And what happens then, like we can write anything then using debug print, it will appear here. Now this window doesn't have to be visible. It will still write if it's not. But it's really useful to write stuff here because it's kind of like copying and pasting into Notepad because you kind of use it for temporary stuff and you can just delete when you want. So it's very easy to kind of write temporary stuff here to check it out. We can use things with debug print. So let me just run this sub on its own. So if I run this sub on its own, from here, it prints out create report. You can see that. But what we want to do is we want to test out our button. So we know that our button calls the click event and this calls create report. So if we click our button, view matches, you can see that it put out create report here. So let me do that in a different way. Let me make this the big screen and let me make this the small one. So if we click on view matches, just watch down here and it will print out create report again. So it printed out create report. Now one thing to point out here is that when we don't want to have code in these click events, all we want to do is to call other subs. And the reason for that is that we don't want to have, like, if we have say create report code here and we create another button click, we don't want to duplicate the code. We just want to call another sub. And also it makes it easy if we decide to delete buttons, or we decide Okay, let's have a shortcut that's from the ribbon, and let's have a shortcut, let's have a different kind of event. We don't have to keep moving a lot of code around. All we need to, it's very easy to delete and add something else and just have a call to the sub that's required. So it just makes the code neater. And as I said, as your project grows, you kind of notice how useful it is to have started with a very nice structure like this. So one thing just to point out, when we're clicking on modules, so click event is the one that is, I'll bring this down to the middle. So click event is the one that we've highlighted, say, at the moment. So if you look up here, you can see that click event, it says click events at the top, and click events is the code module that we have here. Now if we double click on team results, you'll see that's highlighted, and you'll see at the top team results. So just at the start, sometimes it's a bit confusing when you're new to this editor as to what you're actually displaying, because this editor, like, famously hasn't really changed that much in the best part of 20 years. So it's kind of a lot of old school kind of user interface. But having said that, I mean, it's still very, very useful and very, you know, it's small, but it's good to get around and has some very useful tools in it. So, okay, so we've got as far as creating the report. So what we want to do next is we want to put in some code that we want to determine what we're going to do. So the first thing we'll do is we're going to turn off the functionality. So this is kind of what we do when we start any Visual Basic application. So function al. And shortly we'll come to exactly what we're doing when we're turning off functionality. So the first thing we want to do is we want to clear our data. So clear the data, and then we want to create our report. So in a nutshell, this is what we're going to do in our sub. Now, when people are new to VBA, they tend to just like have one sub, and they just tend to like dump everything into it. And this makes your code very inflexible and very messy. And if you want, and what happens is it grows and grows, and you could have 100 lines of a sub. And then when you go to change, it gets very, very messy because you've just got one big pile of code. Whereas if you have it broken down into nice, neat subs, it's much easier to like make a change in one place. And it also makes it easy. If you have one sub, for example, that does something like, say it sends an email, you can just call that sub from everywhere in your application rather than, you know, replicating the code everywhere. So now that we have all these guys, what we're going to do is create some subs that will do this functionality. Now I'm going to copy and paste these in. So let me just copy and paste all these in rather than typing these, because they're pretty straightforward. So these are, again, I'm just creating subs, and I'm just putting the debug, I'm just putting debug print, so it'll print all of these off. Now one thing just to point out, when you're going through the handbook, like when you're going through one of the applications, it's much better to type in the code. So you can copy and paste all the code as you go along. But the thing is, you might kind of just do that, and then you don't really see what's happening. So if you type in the code, and this is based on a lot of feedback I get, if you type in the code, you'll tend to kind of make mistakes. And then when you try and fix the mistakes, it's when you really try to learn. Now, if you run into trouble fixing them, just like send me an email, and I can always fix them very quickly. But generally, this is a really, really good way of learning, because it forces you to actually like see the code, see what it's doing. And if you run into a problem, you have to examine other code and see where it went wrong. And I know myself from doing it, it's just very easy to go in and just copy and paste code and kind of say, oh, I know that, I don't need to worry about it too much. But anyway, so let's get back to our back to our 4 subs here. So we're going to call these, and again, I'll just put in the first letters and control space. So control space like this, and we'll just finish them off like that. So now the other one is spelled nearly the same, so we can just paste this down here, and then we'll just put this in, control space, and it finishes it off. So it didn't even bring up a menu there, because there's nothing else that starts with turn on, so it knew straight away what it was. So the clear data, again, CL, and this will bring up clear report area, and create report then brings up create team results. So create, and we can just do this and space, and we have everything. So again, we'll make this big on the screen, and we'll go to our spreadsheet here, and we'll just make it a bit smaller like this. Let me just bring back in our immediate window, and we'll delete what's in the immediate window. And so when we click on view matches, it should print out the names of all the subs. And you see that so what it's saying is we click on a button and it's calling turn off functionality, clear report area, create team results, and turn on functionality. So we haven't done anything. We haven't done any code so far that's really doing anything, but we've built a nice structure and we can see very clearly in our mind like how we're approaching this. Now we'll go to the turn off functionality, and let me just put in let me just go to the click events. So we're going to call clear report from here as well. So clear report area. So you can see we're calling clear report area when we click on an event or when we click on the button, but we're also calling it here before we actually write our results. So this is to prevent our results getting tainted. So this is why it's very useful to have our clear report area in one sub, because rather than having two sets of code, we just have one set of code and we just call it. Now why this is really useful and why we always strive for this is that if we need to change our code in the future for clear report area, we just need to change it in one place. And this makes fixing errors, finding errors, and making changes much easier. So we always try to avoid having duplicate code when unnecessary. Now again, we can test our other button by we'll just delete all this. So we can test our other button by just clicking here on this, and we click on clear matches and a cleared report area. And again, when we click on the other button, it tells us exactly what it's doing. So we don't have any code in that's exciting, but we can see exactly that our structure is okay. So I'll just add the code in then for the turn off functionality. So this is kind of standard code that you use basically everywhere. Oh, hi Matthew, how are you doing? So Matthew, your question then is why use public sub instead of just sub? Yeah, there's no reason. Like public sub and sub are essentially the same thing, but generally in programming, it's good to be explicit, to actually kind of state what you're doing, rather than it's kind of something you're kind of taught to kind of state explicitly what you're doing rather than leave the default. So if somebody comes in and they're not that familiar with VBA and they're looking at the code, they kind of say, oh, public, and they could check exactly what public means. So to be honest, it's quite a subtle thing, and if you don't put public in, it doesn't make any difference as long as you understand the code. So I hope that makes sense. So getting on to the turn off functionality. So normally in Excel, we have the calculation where you can set the calculation to manual, or you can set the calculation to automatic. And all we're doing here with VBA is this is exactly the same. We're just setting it to manual in this case. And the reason is obviously, like, if we're running a VBA, we don't want lots of calculations to happen, because particularly on a worksheet or workbook with lots of calculations, it could slow it down dramatically. So we want to turn this off. And also it could affect our data, because it could change something and then the data we're reading is wrong. Now two of the other things, display status bar and screen updating, they have to do as well with speed, but this is only the case if you're talking to the screen a lot and if you have a big application. But we just turn them off by default, because if our application grows, we don't need to worry about it. We just know that they're off. Now, enable events is a little bit trickier. An event, so VBA is an event-driven language. So everything we do is kicked off by an event. So for example, when we click the buttons, it's a button click event. When if we had a shortcut in the ribbon, it would be when someone clicks on that. So that would be the event. And we can also have events like when someone makes a change in a worksheet cell, or when the workbook opens, or when the workbook closes. So events kick off the code. So what we want to do is turn off these events, because when we click on our button, we don't want any other events to kind of accidentally click off. So imagine we have code for a worksheet event. So we make a change to a cell and that code gets kicked off. So that can cause us lots of problems, because if we keep changing it, that can keep getting kicked off, and we can end up running out of memory. And the second thing is that if we don't realize it's happening, it can do really subtle things, like that worksheet event could change the data and we mightn't realize what the problem is. And then we're looking at our code and we're thinking, this doesn't make any sense. The code is changing, but the code we've written can't be changing it. So just to avoid all that kind of mess, we just turn off all the events, and then we're safe in the knowledge that we're not going to, that another event isn't going to kind of do something to kind of undercut us. So basically, when we're finished our application, we turn everything back on. So in the case of calculation, we're just going to set it to automatic. Now here's another little tip as well. When we have things like this, which are called constants, we can press Shift F2. So let me just put in that. So let me just type that in. So Shift F2, Shift plus F2. So just the way that that it's noted there. So if you select Shift F2, what it does is it brings up the object browser. Now don't worry too much about the object browser. It basically just has everything about VBA, and a lot of it isn't that relevant. But it's useful in this case because it shows us up all the members of the calculation. So it's like it kind of shows all the siblings of calculation manual. So we can just see what the other consts are. So it's very, very useful. So by consts I mean like constant variables. So these are values that are just set to a number so that we can use them within VBA. So we just set this one then to automatic, and again control space. Now we're just going to turn everything back on here. So false turns things off normally in programming, and true turns it back on. So it's the same as setting it to 1 and 0. They're called Boolean after George Boole, who basically invented modern computers, because it's all based on ones and zeros and so on and so forth. So we've added this code in. Now in a small application like this, it's not going to make a lot of difference. But if you had a large application where you were reading, say, 100,000 records, this would make a big difference. So it's important. Now also what I would say is, normally in a normal application, we'd have another module, and we call it something like utils. So like utilities. And we would put this code here, because it's basically like code that isn't, this code is for every application, so it's not like tied to anything. So we'd put it here, and then basically any sub that we use would basically call the turn on, turn off functionality. So if we created a second report or a third report, we'd be calling this again, but we only have one sub. So we don't keep copying the code, we just have one sub, and we have it in utils. So if we have a lot of kind of common subs in here, we can just basically copy this module into any workbook we use. So it's quite useful. So now we have kind of the basics done, and we're going to get on to the actual kind of main part of this application. And so this is our create results. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy the constants here. So normally you would add constants to your application as you create it, because you don't know in advance. So what a constant is it's a variable. So what I'll do actually, just to make this a bit, I'll just create a blank workbook, and I'm just going to use a temporary workbook just to kind of just explain this. So a const variable is, now normally we declare it globally, but just like, let's just test here. So we do a const, and we'd say like the max students, and we'd say as long. So so we got an error here. We have to set a value at the start. So we set the value at the start. So let's look at another one. So we'll do dim l count. So count is the number of students as long. So both of these are kind of variables. The difference is the constant is set to a value at the start, and then this value can't be changed. L count, we can set it to a value when we declare it, but we can change it. We can change the value no matter how many, countless times within our application. Now if we try to change max students, we'll get an error. So if we run this code, it says assignment to constant not permitted. So essentially a constant is making a variable read only. It's just saying you're not allowed to change this. But the reason that we use it, now I'll close this down again. So I'll just save this workbook actually, now that I think of it. So the reason that we use them is it makes our code more readable. Now you notice here that they're all in uppercase. This is really just a convention that I've used back since the 90s, and it just means constants are just easy to recognize from variables. But the reason we use them is because, first of all, they make the code more readable by just having a constant like this rather than just having like random values throughout your code. And the second thing is, if every time we refer to the start range we use this, then if we decide in the future to make a change, we can make the change here and it will permeate throughout our whole application. So it's all about making our code readable and making it easy to update. And also it makes it difficult for the code to accidentally change something. So the constants are quite simple to use, but they're very, very useful. So we're going to start with the clear report area, because as I said, when we're going to be writing like an application, you're often testing if the data is correct. So it's a good idea to have the clear report part working first, because this means then that you don't have to keep manually deleting the data. So now what we put in here was our constant. So we're basically saying CN report. So let me break all this down. CN report is the worksheet name. So if we look over here, what you'll see is that there's two names for the worksheet. Now it's normally sheet 1, sheet 1. Now the one on the right here, report in this case, is the one in the worksheet. So that's the bottom tab of the worksheet. If we double click here and we look at the properties, you can see report is down here as well. So this is the worksheet. So if I change this here, or I change this on the worksheet tab, it will be changed in all these places. So you can see it's 45 here. And if we go to the tab, you can see that it's changed to 45. If I rename this here again and change it back to what it was, you'll see that it changed back everywhere. So that's the worksheet name. Now what interests us is the one on the left. So the one on the left, we refer to this as the code name. And what this means is that, so first of all, we see it here. We can change the name of it here, but the user can't change the name. So this means it's very useful. So it's like kind of a permanent ID that we use. And if the user changes the worksheet name, as long as we're referring to it with the code name, our code will work fine. And we can use it directly. So what you might often see in code is something like this. If we want to refer to a worksheet in the current workbook, people tend to do stuff like this. So worksheets, and then they use report. And this is fine. This gives us back the same worksheet. The difference is the code is a bit more long-winded, which isn't the end of the world. But the big problem is if the user changes the name of the worksheet, then this code will no longer work. We'll have to go and change the name of the worksheet in our code. But when we're using the code name, the user can change the name of that worksheet as much as they want, and it won't affect our code. But again, this only works when the code is in the same workbook, which is most of the time. If it's in a different workbook, then you can't use this to refer to the worksheet. So we'll be looking at a worksheet that's outside in a while. Okay, so we have the code here, and this code will clear our cells. So we've basically said on the worksheet, give us back the range, and the range is, again, this is a constant, so we can right click on the constant or any variable or any function, select definition, and it'll bring us to the definition. So we can see that the definition of this is simply E3 to Z1000. Now we can right click again and select last position, and this will bring us back to our last position. So we're basically saying of this range, clear the contents. And of course, as ever, we want to check that this is working correctly. So we'll just go out and just put data in random cells. Always good to put one in the first line, and just random cells all around, and make sure that we're hitting the last column. And then we click on clear matches, and you can see it cleared. Now also, if we click on view matches, it should clear it, because we're also calling the same sub in view matches. And again, it did. So so this makes our life much easier now, because when we start to add data, each time we run it, we'll automatically delete the last results. So this will make things much easier. So the first thing we want to do is read the user. So read basically the user settings. So the user settings are here on the worksheet. Let me bring that right into the middle. So these are the user settings, and the user basically makes their settings there, and we read from these cells. So how we do that is quite straightforward. So we just declare variables, and let me just press this down a bit. So we declare variables like this, and then we put the values in it. Now we could make these into constants, but I just want to make the code a bit clearer, just because this is the first application. So normally we'd make these values into constants, but just to show you that it's C4, C5, and C6. Now again, one thing that I always do is when I'm dealing with a range, I always put it in a variable. The reason is the code is much more readable now, because we can see when we refer to the year, we can see, okay, it's S year is the variable name, so obviously it's the year, and S workbook is the workbook. So when we come back to our code, if we haven't looked at the code in a while, we can come back to the code, and when we see S year, it makes much more sense than if we had like CN report range sprinkled everywhere. And this is something I see all the time in people's code, where they just have the range and they refer to the range, and it makes it very difficult to update the code, because you have to check through the code and see exactly what it's doing. You kind of have to run through the code to kind of figure out how it's working. Whereas when you actually have nice variable names, you can kind of see at a glance what the code is doing, and then if required, you can look a bit deeper. So we can run the code and just see if it's reading the correct fields. So I put a breakpoint here. I just click in the site, or you can press F9 if you want. So when we run the code, what this means is that it will pause the code at the breakpoint. So anytime, you can put in as many as you want. They must be on a line of code. So you can't put one here. You can't put one on the dim line. So it won't allow you. But any line of code, you can put one. And as soon as VBA reaches this line of code, it will stop. So we'll click on View Matches here, and the yellow highlight means it's stopped. So we can use these items up here. So step into, step over, just to step into our code. Now I'm just going to use the shortcut key F8, because it's just much quicker to do it. So F8 just steps over. So I've stepped over S year, so this line has happened. So this value should have assigned to S year. And we can, if we just hover over S year, we can see it tells us what it is. Now we step over workbook, and again we can just see what's in workbook, and we step over user team, and we can see that it's Brazil, or Argentina I should say, and so it's all, so that's all correct. So we're happy with that. So we can click in the site here. Let me just, I'll press F9 actually, it's yeah. So and so that's all good. So we're getting the values that we want. So the first thing that we want to do is we want to read from a workbook. I like to do sometimes in programming, and VBA particularly, it's very good to start at the end. So it's kind of work it back. It kind of makes things a bit easier. So we want to open the workbook. So we want to open the workbook to read our data. So we're going to open a workbook. So we're going to create a workbook variable. So this will store where our workbook is going to go. And then what we want to do is we want to assign it to the workbook that we open. So we use workbooks open. And we're going to, so this takes a lot of parameters. So if we look here, you'll just see, let me just debug compile. Okay, oh yeah, so I need to just have this. So just that, yeah, the IntelliSense wasn't coming up, but what happens here, if you're assigning a value like this, so if you use workbooks open without assigning a value, you can just pass the parameters. But if you're assigning a value, you have to use parentheses. So that's just something to be aware of. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to get the file name. So the first one is the file name. So that's fairly straightforward. So we'll just say variable S file name. So we haven't decided how we're getting that yet. So we'll just put in S file name. So we're going to work it back from there. Now the next thing is we have a parameter called read only. So when we've like optional, these are all optional parameters, which means we don't have to specify them, and if we don't, they'll use default. So rather than putting in spaces, we can specify the one we want by doing this. So read only equals true. So we don't have to say read only equals true, but it makes our code very readable. So you can see at a glance that we're opening this for read only. And it's always good to open a workbook to be read only if you're not going to write to it. It's because this prevents you accidentally writing to it. And if you do, VBA will tell you. You'll get the error message, and so then you can correct your code. And also if someone else has the workbook open, you don't need to worry about it if it's read-only, because it'll just open a read-only copy. So okay, we're opening the workbook and we're opening the file name. So what should our file name be? So we'll create the file name variable here, and this of course is a string, which basically means text. So, and then we set the file name. So we want to assign it to something. So we're going to use the workbook. So we're going to use the workbook. So that's the actual file name. But what we want to do is we want to define the path as well. And we're just going to say for simplicity in this application, it's in the current path. So the path of this workbook. So we can get it by saying this workbook, which is the workbook with the code, and we can get the actual path. And so this was kind of the old name for folders. So this is basically our directories. We used to say the directory and the path. So the path is basically the list of folders that it's in. So, and we just want to put a backslash here. And so this builds our file name, and then we're going to open this file name. So we'll just put our breakpoint here and we'll run the code. Again, we click on the button because that's how we're going to be running it. And we can see our file name is, so we just click on file name, it come up there. Now if we want to view these, we can also do a view locals window. And this shows us basically, so I'm going to close our immediate window. So this basically, yeah. Oh, hi from Israel, by the way. Sorry, Excel Studio, just saw you there. How you doing? So what this does is, let me just bring this down. So this by default puts in all our variables and shows us the value. So we can see the value of all our variables here. Now you can see workbook is nothing. That's because we haven't done this line yet, so it still isn't anything. But we can look here and we can just see what all our values are. So this is a handy way of having a look at them. Now we're going to step over this line. So we step onto the next line, or step into it, doesn't matter in this case. So we step over this line, and this should open our file, and you can see that it did. It opened the correct workbook. And when we get here, we've just ended. So when we got there, we just ended. So normally what I do here is I leave, there's code where we close the workbook and I leave that to the end. But just to stop us having to keep closing it, I just put the close item here. You can always comment it out if there's any reason that we don't need to do it. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that if we try to open the workbook, so just imagine that the user comes along and the user puts in, say they, I'll just make this very clear. So say they accidentally spelled the name wrong, or the proper name gets changed. So when our code runs now in this case, what happens is, so let me get rid of that breakpoint there. So what happens is that we get this error from VBA. It says, sorry, couldn't find, and as errors go from VBA, this is actually one of the better ones. It actually explains kind of almost in English what's the problem. The problem is that we have two options here. We can press debug or end. Now this is fine if we're just testing, but if we give this to a user, we don't want a user to click debug like this and end up in the code, because as far as they're concerned, this is a catastrophic error in a software application. What we want to do is we want it to behave in a graceful manner. So I'll just run it on again. Now if we click end, the application ends, and in this case maybe that's okay, but sometimes we don't want it to end. So for example, imagine you have an application that reads files. So say it reads music files. If you open an invalid file, you don't want the application to end. You don't want it to terminate, like say, oh, don't like this format, and just end. It should carry on doing what it's doing in a predefined manner. So the reason I explain all this is we're just going to handle the situation if the file name doesn't exist. So we're just going to check for it, give it a nice error, and we're going to terminate in a nice manner. And we're not going to give the user an option to stop in the code. So there is basically a function that just checks if a file exists. So there comes from, as I said, back in the 90s, folders were basically referred to as directories. So there is kind of directory. So if there equals blank, it means it couldn't find a file name. Now, if this happens, we're just going to give a nice little message to the user. So let me copy that rather than type in the message. and let me tab this across like this. And so we'll write out a message box. And then what we want to do, we want to exit the sub. So if we can't find the file name, we don't want to continue on, because our application will just give that error again. It'll just try and open the workbook. And even if it didn't try and open it and try to do other stuff, it just can't carry on because we didn't open the workbook. So we're basically saying, didn't work this time, so please check the file and try again. Now, if we were running, say the application was running, it was kind of a user form, and we were pressing different buttons, so different buttons did different things. We mightn't want to end the application. We might want to exit the sub. But the application might still be running. But the thing about it is, it's much nicer because the user's getting a really nice message. Now, the second thing about this is that if you come back to your code after, say, a couple of months, and this error, so you accidentally have the wrong file name, the code will actually tell you the problem straight away. So you don't have to debug the code or trying to figure out what's happening. It'll just tell you straight away, here is the problem. And so it saves you kind of wasting time debugging through code. So what we've done there is just basically some simple error handling. We're just making our application just a bit robust. So now what we want to do now is we want to get the worksheet. So we've opened the workbook. So the next thing we want to do is we want to get the actual worksheet. So we can use our workbook variable. So the workbook refers to a workbook like in Excel, or basically an Excel workbook. And in Excel, a workbook has a worksheet, a collection of worksheets, and also we can access these in VBA using this, and we can use the name of it. So because it's outside, it doesn't have this, it's not the same workbook as the code. We can't use the actual code name of the worksheet. But in this case, we don't want to. What we want to do is we want to open the worksheet specified by the year. So our worksheet has our data worksheet is split up into worksheets, and each worksheet has a number. So it's 2014 for the 2014 World Cup, 2010 for the 2010 World Cup. Now I have year as a string here. Normally year would be a number, but in this application we're not using it to calculate anything, so it's fine to use it as a string. So this will return us a worksheet. So what we want is we want to have a variable to place the worksheet in. So as a worksheet, so we're saying this is a worksheet, and we're saying can you store this in our worksheet. Now essentially what we're doing here is we're just giving the worksheet a name. We're just putting it somewhere so that when we want to access that worksheet, we have a variable. And a worksheet variable essentially allows us to do anything with a worksheet that we could do in Excel. So I haven't been doing this as much as I should, but normally when you're writing code, you normally use debug compile, and this checks all our code for errors. And then when it doesn't find any, it's grayed out. So as you're writing code normally, now of course for me, to write something like this is straightforward, but normally if you're writing code, especially kind of a new application, and I've done this one like a lot of times, but if you're writing a new application, it's always good to press debug compile just to make sure that you've no errors in your code, and then you know that your code is quite solid. And like we have been checking our code as we've gone through, we've been checking the output. So we're not going to like write a bunch of code and then at the end get a lot of nasty surprises when like everything starts going wrong. We know at this point that we've got as far as opening the workbook. And hopefully when we check, we'll know we've got as far as opening the correct worksheet. So what we want to do next of all is we want to get the actual data. So we want to get a range of data. So we have the worksheet, and how we get the range of data is, again, another variable, a range variable. So these are very important. So the three variables is we have a range, the range is on a worksheet, and the worksheet is on a workbook. So it's just like in real life, as someone said, I want you to like update a worksheet with the range of a worksheet with these values. The first thing you'd have to do is figure out the workbook or open the workbook. Then you'd have to go to the sheet in that workbook, and then you'd have to set the range. And again, this is kind of the standard code if you're opening a workbook. You get the workbook, you get the worksheet, and then you get the range from the worksheet. So we're going to just create a variable, and the variable is the range data, or we're going to call it RG data. And when we're setting any of these things, they're not. So we have basic variables like integers and strings. And they're just like cells. They contain like very, very basic kind of very, very primitive information. So just like text, numbers, currency. But when we're doing something more complicated, like a range or a worksheet, we need to use set when we're assigning. So we do set, and again, we get the worksheet. So sheet data, remember, is our worksheet. We get the range. Each worksheet has a range, and we can just specify the cells that we want. Now, in this case, we're using the constant data range start. And this is basically A1. So we're saying we want the range A1. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use current region. So let me just explain what current region is. And I'll explain by just opening up another kind of sample spreadsheet. So imagine that we have values here. And they're kind of rectangular. We'll say it's a rectangular kind of set of data. Now the data that we have doesn't matter. So if we specify any range here, so if we specify any cells here like E5, H7, or even some cell like this that has one of these in it, if we specify this range and say give me the current region, VBA will give us back all the adjacent cells. Now what it means by all the adjacent cells is all the cells, and it considers blank cells a border. So if we had cells here, and so say we've just got data here and data here and data here. If we get the range here and say give me the current region, VBA will give us this region. Sorry, let me go down. It'll give us back this region. So this is the current region. Now if we put a value here, then the region will go down to the next kind of row of blank cells, and it will go to here. So current region basically gives us back a rectangular set of data. So this is very nice because it means we don't have to do things like get last row, get last cell, and build a range. We kind of get the range for free. So this sets the range. So what I want to do now is just to ensure that our range is correct, we can actually just check it in the watch window. But what we can also do is just print it out to our immediate window. So we can do debug, print, and the range. And a very useful property of the range is address. So this is basically the cell address. So when we run our code here, it will print the result out to the immediate window. So even though the immediate window wasn't visible, it'll still print it out. So if we do Control G, you can see that it printed to the bottom there, A1 to K65. And so let me just clear this, and let me just do this, run this again. So clear matches, so view matches. So again, it's just a bit slow because I'm using an encoder on, so A1 to K65. So if we look in our World Cup data, so World Cup matches, you'll see that the data actually goes down to K65. So a very nice way of getting back our code. So that's actually the column K. Or sorry, getting back our data, I should say. So let's close this and we won't save it. So let me just save this again. And let me go back here. So okay, so far so good. So now we've got the range. And once we get the range, what we want to do is we want to loop through it. So we want to go through each row one at a time. Now there's a number of different ways we can do it. Well, there's two kind of ways we can really do it with a for loop. And the first one that we're going to use a for each loop. So for each basically says, give me back one of this collection each time until there's none left. So a way to think of this is, imagine somebody was standing and they had a bunch. So imagine it was all written on paper. So imagine someone had a bunch of paper slips and each one represented a row. So each time you would say, give me one of the slips, and you check that slip and see, is the team, does this match the user team? And then you'd say, give me the next one. So this is essentially what for each is doing. So we call our variable reg_row, and this is a range variable. So again, it represents a range. And what we're saying is for each. So this is a place that we'll put each one that we get. So for each row in, and so the range of our data. So this is all our data, rows. So rows is a collection of our rows. And when we say for each, we get back a row each time. And now that once we have a for, we have to end it. So we do next. Now we can have next cur row. You don't need to specify the variable in the next. You don't have to do it. If you have multiple for loops, it's quite useful because you can see where the for loop ends. But most of the time, you don't really need to do it. So in the actual handbook, what I do is I have all the comments that we paste in first. I'll just put them in, like we don't, because I'm going through it anyway. It's not that important. But when you're actually building the code, it's quite nice because so you look at this and you can basically say, okay, this is the first task I must do, and these are the other tasks that I have to do. So we want to read the team names first. Actually, we'll go with this because it is actually quite a nice way of doing it. We have our comments, and we're just going to add the code as we need it. So what we want to do again is we want to read our data. So each time that we get a row, so this is a row, so this gives back a range of a row. Now we're saying cells, so cells gives back basically a cell based on a row and a column. Now we're saying row 1. This causes a bit of confusion, but we're saying row 1 because our range here is just a row, so there's only one row in it. So in other words, we've said give us back, each time we're saying give us back a row from the group of rows, so it's always going to be 1. And this is our column, so the column basically refers to the column team 1, and so this is the column in our data. And actually we can just right click if we want to see what it is. We can just right click and go to definition, and so it's column E in the data. So this is just an easy way of reading our data. So rather than just having letters, it makes the code much more readable. So what we want to do is we want to have a variable where we put this data. So we'll call it steam1, and so we just declare it up here as a string. So we have our team, and we're going to put our team into a variable. Now if we like, what we could do here is we can do debug print and print out the team. So we're going to print out team 1's name. Let's open up this window here so that we can actually see it, and let's clear it out, and we'll open up this guy. And so just keep an eye in the immediate window here. When we click view matches, it should print out the first team for every single match, and you can see that it printed out all the team names. So this shows us how it's actually going through basically all the rows one at a time. So again, this is like a sanity check. So we've said, okay, so far so good, everything is working kind of nice and neatly. So one thing to point out, when we use statements like for and if, so statements like say for ends with next, if ends with end if, we always indent our code. And what this means is we tab it in. So we can use this up here, so, or sorry, this one here, which indents the code, and this outdents, which is shift and tab. So if we can move the code like this, but each time we hit a for loop, we indent one. And then when we come down to next, when we finish this, when we come to next, we move back out. This makes the code much easier to read. And also, by having like similar lines under each other, it makes the code, it makes it easier to spot errors, and it makes it easier to update. So we can copy team 1, the team 1 line, and we know that getting team 2 is going to be very similar. We're going to create a variable called team 2, which will be very similar to team 1 in that it's just a string. And instead of team 1, because we have our variables nicely named, we know that this should be team 2. Now if we do control space, we can see indeed that it brings up call data 2. So this is team 2 in the column. So now we've got team 2. Now if we like, we could print out team 2 as well, but we're not going to do that. We'll just take it for granted that it worked pretty well. Now the next thing that we want to do is, so we've already got our user team. We want to check if our user team equals our, so if the team 1 equals the user team. So again, this is the team selected by the user. Now the problem with doing a sign like this is that it doesn't take into account different cases. And in this, what we want to ensure is that even if Brazil or something has a small b, we want it still to match. So we'll use the string comp function. So string comp essentially returns 0 if there's a match. So you give it 2 strings like this, and then we say VB, and what we want to do is text compare. So text compare means compare the text. It doesn't matter if it's upper or lower. Binary compare means it does matter. So we want to compare like this, and we also want to compare team 2. So we're basically, if it's team 1 or team 2 match the user team, we want to do something with them. So we basically say if team 1 equals 0, or. So we're saying or team 2. So we put in our or statement. And of course we have to finish with it then. So this is our comment here. So if the team we are looking, we want to do the following. So let me just tab these, let me just delete these lines here. So I'll just close down the immediate window. So we'll put our end if here. So you can see our end if now. Our end if is indented inside. So you can see that it's clear that our if statement is inside the next. And again, we indent our code here. So this makes it very clear that the code in between the if and end if is the code that will be executed if it's true. And so executed means that the code will actually run. So the next thing that we want to do is we want to count the rows. So we need to track the row that we're writing the data to. So when we start off, the row that we're writing the data to is row number 3. And then when we write the first thing, we want to move our pointer to 4 and we want to move it to 5. So we just want to store the number of the next row we're going to write to. So we create a variable just to hold this value. And again, this is very, very common when you're writing out data. And I'll just put, so we declare another variable here. And so row rep, so row report, and we set it to be row rep start. So this is the number 3, our first row. Now, every time, so if we go into the if statement, we're going to move to the next. We're going to write the row and we're going to move to the next value. So we want to add 1 to rep, and this is how we do it. And this is very common in programming, but it's kind of counterintuitive the first time you see it. So equals here actually doesn't mean equals. Equals means that the value here is assigned to the result of this. So what we do is we evaluate whatever's here and we place it in here. So it's an assign. Now if we have an if before this, the equals then means a comparison. So this is one little confusing thing in VBA. But when you ever see an if like this, when you ever see an equals without an if or without a for, it's an assignment. So all this is doing is adding 1 to row rep. So the first time you write a value, row rep will add 1 and it will become 4. The next time you write a value, it'll be 5 and so on. If we don't do this, then every time we're just going to keep overwriting the same row. So now what we want to do is we want to get the destination. So we have the row that we're reading from, but we want to get the destination. So we'll create a variable for the destination and we'll just call it like this, and then we'll set it to be a value. And what we want it to be is we want it to be a range. So we'll use cn report. So cn report refers to the worksheet with the report, and we want to get the range. Now we have a starting cell and an end cell, and we want to get the range for that. So let's put it in like this. So this is the starting cell and this is the ending cell, and we just want to put in the start cell and the end cell. So we're going to use whatever the current row is. So that's going to be row rep that we just looked at. So this variable, the current row, this is going to be our destination each time, as we just saw. So we put the row in here. So this is the row, and our column is going to be one of the constant variables. So we're always going to write the match. We're going to write the match no out to the very first one. So let me just put no here. So match no. And so call match no. So just to be clear, call match no refers to this cell. So from this column E, so it refers to E. And the last one we're going to do is stage. And so we put in the constant for the stage as well. And then this will give us back the range. So let me just make that a bit clearer. So we currently, the current row we're looking at is row 3. So we take the first column on row 3, and we take the last column, and this will give us a range. So we basically give us the range from E current row, which is 3, to O3. The next time then our row will be 4, so we'll want the range from E4 to O4 and so on. So now we have the destination. So this is very easy. We can just easily write the value to the destination. And so we write the value like this. We say destination.value equals, and we say the current row, which we know is the row we've been given, and just the value. Now this is the fastest way to copy data. If you're dealing with a lot of data, it's actually very, very fast to copy data like this. Using things like select, copy and paste is actually a very slow way of doing it. But it's fine if you just have a small application. But if you're dealing with a lot of data, it's much better to assign it like this. Or even better is to put it into an array and then just write the array straight out. So now that we've got to this point, of course, what we want to do is we want to run the code and see does it actually run. And there you go, it listed all the values. So Argentina got into the 2014 World Cup final. So you can just see the path to the final there. And you can see they played Germany in the final and Netherlands in the semi-final and so on. So what it's nice to do is just put a breakpoint here and just see how the code works. So we click on view matches. And so our code pauses. So right, it just opened that. So let's step over this. So we'll step into, doesn't matter at this point. And we can see that as team 1 is as team 1. And so the reason for this is that one thing actually I didn't do was what we need to do in the current region. We don't always have to do it, I mean, it doesn't matter. But what we want to do in the current region is we want to get rid of the header. And we get rid of the header by basically moving down one and removing one row. In this case, it doesn't matter. It's reading the header and it won't make a difference, but it's not good practice because most applications we won't want to do that. So we set range data equal range data dot resize. So we want to remove one row, which is going to be the header, and we want to push it down one row. So offset 1 basically. And it's resize the current size, so rows.count -1. So let's just stop and let's just run this again. So I'll just close this down and we click on view matches then. And so when we go past the first S team, you can see that the team is Brazil, and we can see that the next team is Croatia. Now again, we can keep our locals window open just to make it easy to see what's happening. And you can see there's a lot of data here. Now we can see team 1 is Brazil, team 2 Croatia, row report is 3, and year is 2014. The workbook that the user picked is World Cup matches, and the user team is Argentina. So we compare the values here. Now the first value won't obviously go into it, so we'll just keep going. So rather than just like stepping through the code until we get in here, so say we wanted to just check the code in here, we can just put a breakpoint here and we can just run the code. So the code will stop once it's got inside. And so it got inside when it hit Argentina. So we're saying, okay, give us back this range. Now remember, we said this range is on the report. So if we want to check the range, we can just add it as a watch. So a watch is kind of like the locals window, except the watch is where we put our own stuff in. The locals gives us the general values by default. Now we can take any range here. So I'm going to put range dest and the address. So this will show us the address. So it's nothing so far, we haven't assigned it. And as soon as we assign it, you can see it's E3 to O3. So that's E3 to O3. So this is our destination range. And again, the next time it'll be E4. Now you can see that stepping through the code like I'm doing here, it's a very useful way of understanding VBA, and it's a very useful way of trying out stuff and seeing exactly what happens. So we run this code, we write the value. So if we look in our worksheet, it should have the actual data. And you can see that it does have the data. So, and then we move on to our next row, and then we just run on. So the next time we hit two teams at Argentina, we have Argentina playing Iran. And we can see our row report is now. So this variable is now 4, and so on, and this will just keep going until it reaches all the records. So just one last thing we want to do. So sometimes if we enter a team that doesn't exist, or say we make a mistake, so for example, imagine we add Ireland, and now Ireland didn't play in the World Cup finals. So if we click on view matches, it like appears that nothing happened, and like maybe there's an error or whatever, but it could be an error, it could be that just nothing happened. We just want to make sure, we want to let the user know that there's no data. So we want to explicitly say there was no data for this event, so for this particular team in this event. So we need to check it somehow. So how do we check if there was no data? Well, quite simply, there's a number of ways we can do it, but we assigned rep row at the start to equal to 3. So we set it to be the row 3. So what we can say is, if it still equals row 3, this means we haven't written any new rows, because every time we write a new row to a report, this gets updated by 1. So we add 1 to it. So if it's still the same as it was at the start, then we know that we haven't written any records. So again, we can just give the user kind of a nice message to say that there wasn't any records for this team. So this is also useful as well. If you come back like in a say you came back in a month and you were looking at some application and you go to run it, and say like the application was picking customers and you ran it and there was no customers in New York, it looks like it doesn't do anything if you don't have this message in it. And you might be thinking, does this code work or not? So you have to kind of debug the code, look through the code, make sure it's okay. But when you have a message like this, you can see that it says, okay, no matches were found for Team Ireland in the World Cup for year 2014. So you know that it's actually worked fine. Let me just close this window for a second so that it's a bit neater the way it comes up. So we click on view matches. Yeah, it comes up like that. The reason it does that, is because the other one is open. So it's to do with which workbook is kind of active. So if I close the workbook first and then do it, it should actually come up on this like this. So no matches were found for Team Ireland in the World Cup for year 2014. So that's a nice message. Now if we kind of said, hold on a second, we know that they played in the World Cup, or if we say, for example, we do something like this. So we spell Brazil wrong. Actually, it looks right both ways, in fact. But we say this and then we click on view matches. And it says no matches were found for Team Brazil. Now we know Brazil hosted the World Cup, so we'd be like, well, that doesn't make sense. But it'd be fairly obvious what the problem was. We're saying, okay, it's not finding data. Why isn't it? So we'd say, is it the spelling or is it the data? So we'd go and check the data, we'd go and check the spelling and so on. And then this would tell us straight away what the problem was. So that basically concludes the application 1. And let me just run it again with actually Brazil spelled properly. And you can see the data. So as I said, like this is quite a nice application. Has a lot of very common techniques that you use in VBA. Like you're opening a workbook, you're checking data for certain criteria, and then you're writing the data to another worksheet. So a lot of what you use here, you can use it as kind of fundamentals for your own application. And also what we looked at here was the structure. So how you put it together, how you test it using debug, compile as you go along, and by using debug print to write out the data. And also you can step through the code using the watch window. And the idea is that each time you do a small bit of coding, you do these tests and you make sure your code is okay. So then when you run to the next part, you know that you're not going to suddenly get kind of swamped in errors that are happening all over the place. And when you just take, even if you do have an error, it's much easier if you take it one at a time. And you also know that the error you're looking at is very unlikely to be caused by an error somewhere else. So we're creating nice solid code, and as we add to it, we've got a very nice foundation. So that's essentially application 1, and I hope I didn't go too fast or it wasn't too advanced. If you've got any questions, please go ahead and ask. I'm going to be here for the next 5-10 minutes, so if you have any questions just on application 1, just feel free to go ahead. Now again, one thing I would say is that it's definitely good, if you're going through this, definitely good to type in the code, because you'll make mistakes, and by fixing these mistakes you'll make yourself better at VBA. And also what's good to do as well is debug through the code, obviously, but make changes. So say, for example, that if the user picks a team that you want to say you want to create a second report, and that just counts the number of goals the team got, and see if you can do that on a different sheet. So keep the original one and try and do it on a different sheet, or see, okay, what happens if I change this small bit of code? And so playing around with something that works and seeing the differences that the changes make, and debugging and seeing these changes really, really helps you learn how to program. Because it's tempting, like with everything, it's tempting to sit and kind of read through something or just look at something and say, okay, I get it. But the real way to learn this, like learning anything, is to actually go and write the code and actually make the mistakes and actually fix them. So just like learning to drive a car, you have to actually go and do it. And then even if what you do isn't that good, you just learn so much by doing it. Oh, thanks very much, Peter. Glad that you enjoyed it. I was in Wellington many years ago. I think 2003. God, 14, 16 years ago. Yeah, really nice place actually. Really nice. So if you've got any questions or queries or comments or anything, just please feel free to let me know. And yeah, I'm going to leave the replay up. So basically, the link that we used here, you can basically view the replay in the same place. So it's just the same link. But after this ends, so when I stop streaming, it just takes YouTube a while to process it. So this is an hour. So in an hour's time, you'll probably be able to watch it. Probably sooner. But so the replay should be available. And I'll leave that up for a week, so you can come back at any stage, like in the next week, and just have a look and just see, or just work through it like yourself. So again, doing the videos is really useful because it's just you can kind of show so many tips and tricks in the video. And if I was to take, say, stuff like the watch window and all this and put all that information into the handbook, it would just be overwhelming, and it kind of gets you away from building the application. So that's why I really like the videos. Yeah, thanks very much, Matthew. Very glad that you enjoyed it. Hope that it was helpful. You're going to be rethinking your project. Yeah, well, good luck with that, Sean. Yeah, the webinar, as I said, the webinar will be available for the week. And yeah, Sean, if you have any questions, just feel free to just, as always, drop me an email. Yeah. Thanks very much, Jay. Always learn something useful. Yeah, glad that you do. That's what I hope anyway when I do these webinars, is to kind of give some good information. So there was quite, I kind of packed in a lot of stuff. I mean, it was 1:15, but it's kind of good. You can kind of go back and watch it kind of at your leisure. Yeah, no problem at all, Sean. No problem at all. Yeah, Peter, I hope to run in the coming weeks. I hope to run more of these live webinars for the different applications. So the next one, I'll do them like in number, because even though they're kind of standalone, I kind of approach certain things sequentially. So the next one I do is application 2. And application 2 is similar to this one, but it kind of builds on it. It's kind of summing up the data. So it reads the same data, but it actually sums up. And this is another thing that you do in VBA, and it's a bit more trickier than just copying and pasting. Okay, thanks very much, John. Glad that it made a lot of sense and that it's easy to follow. I sometimes worry if I'm kind of getting too advanced or maybe throwing in too much stuff, but it's great now that you can follow it and that it makes sense. But again, if it's a lot of stuff, just go back through it and as I said, I'll leave it up for the week. Oh, sorry, Matchy, I missed you there. A couple came in together. This table is not Excel table. You would have to press Control T. Yeah, Matchy, in this case, I formatted the data as a table just to make it look a bit neater. But I didn't want to get into the kind of didn't want to get into tables because I do tables in I think the fourth or fifth application. So I didn't want at this point to get into tables. So I just treated a table as a range. And unless you're doing specific stuff with a table, if you're just reading data from it, I mean, you can just treat the table as a range anyway, so it doesn't make much difference. It's just if you want to do stuff with the table, like insert and delete columns, that you need to kind of treat it as a table. So does it take much time to search for the column name each time? Well, we're not searching for the column name, so we basically put the column. I don't know what you mean in this one. In this one, like we just had it as a constant, so we didn't have to search. But you mean if you wanted to search each time, like using find? Yeah, if you use find, it can slow it down. But it depends. I mean, if your application is doing it like 4 or 5 times, it doesn't make that much difference. But I mean, if you have like thousands, if you're doing like hundreds or thousands of finds, it could slow it down like dramatically. So you're better. That's why you're better having a column. Yeah, another reason like that you don't really have the column name. I don't like to find is that the user can easily change the text in a find. So if your columns are always going to be in the same place, then it's fine to read from. But if you use a find and the user accidentally changes a letter, then the find doesn't work, and it's kind of tricky. So it's much better to use constants maybe. Okay, thanks very much, Brian. You're arriving late to the party today, but thanks for the work here on the website. Okay, thanks very much, Brian. I'm glad that you enjoyed it. Hope it made sense and helped. So yeah, so who somebody Peter was asking me, yeah. So I hope to run more of these in the next few weeks, and I'll get on to application 2 the next time. And because, as I say, there's a natural progression between all these. But so if you've got questions on application 2, like just make a note of them, and then you can ask me on the next one when I run it. Or if you want, you can just email me beforehand, and I can just go through it when I'm actually doing it live. Oh, you're welcome, Paul. Glad that you liked my approach. Thanks very much. Oh, you're welcome. You're welcome, Matchy. Yeah, I always try to teach practical VBA. I know when, like as a programmer, when I started with VBA, just trying to wade through kind of all the stuff that you don't need, and for someone, and it would have been just so useful for someone to say, okay, this is practical stuff you need. You don't need to worry about that. So I always, when I'm teaching VBA, I'll always try and go for the practical, useful stuff that you'll use. So everyone, thanks very much. I'm going to leave it there if that's okay with everyone. If you've got further questions, just email me. It's just paul@excelmacromastery.com, or leave a comment on the blog, and I'll get back to you. So the next time that I'm running one of these, I'll just send out the normal email and the link, and I'll see you all then. So okay, good night everyone, and thanks very much. Oh, sorry. So, Sean, protecting the other cells from being overwritten. In your solution, a cell could be overwritten. Yeah, it's possible. I mean, well, normally the way like you kind of write this, normally you don't really worry about it. I mean, when you're writing the code, you just basically, I mean, you just test it on. You're sure that it's okay. If the idea that it would overwrite was an issue, you could lock the cells. You could just lock the cells and lock the worksheet if you wanted. That would be an option. Generally, like you don't need it unless it's some kind of requirement in by the user in the application. Anyway, the instruction cells could be deleted. Oh, I get what you're saying. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Generally, yeah. Generally, you'd protect those. Yeah. I mean, in this case, I just didn't. But generally, yeah, you'd protect those sheets that you don't want the code to change. Absolutely. Okay, everyone. Good night, and I will talk to you on the next one of these.